And there it goes.
Mhm.
Right. The first thing I'd like to ask you about is a bit about your own background. What's your
Mhm.
role or job title, and what's your connection to education and AI?
Yes. So I'm my role at University College London is I'm a lecturer in AI for. I mean, officially it's AI for biomedicine and healthcare. Um, but at the end of the day, my research is there is some connection to, healthcare because I do research on knowledge delivery on healthcare scenarios and knowledge understanding in terms of AI, of medical text or medical knowledge. But in a broader context, my research is on AI for education, where there is a big connection to open educational resources because by my historical research projects I've been working a lot with open educational resources, and I'm also part of the UNESCO chair for artificial intelligence, which is at UCL, where within that agenda AI for open educational resources has a huge roadmap. Yeah, so in that context, I do a lot of research work around building personalized learning scenarios around open educational resources. Um, I would say that's my connection to AI in education. But primarily and on a secondary basis, I also do a lot of collaborative work with the Institute of Education around personalized learning and building personalized learning platforms. I do some work with them around trying to leverage large language models for education with the right guardrails and constraints that satisfy, learning sciences inspired objectives of learning. Yeah, I would say those are like the main contexts in which AI in education is linked to my role.
Sounds good. And to ground our conversation so we're on the same page, what do
Mhm.
you call AI? What does AI mean to you?
So to me, artificial intelligence means many algorithms that could help a machine mimic human-like intelligence or decision-making capabilities. Yeah, I would say that would be my definition for artificial intelligence.
Right, so it could be quite broad. I guess human-like.
Yes.
What does that encompass? What could be some different examples that might be unusual AI?
Mm, I would say, I mean, it's a fairly broad definition, and I mean, in my capacity as a researcher, I am receptive to that broad definition. And some of the examples are like, I mean, current examples that we have are, you know, algorithms that can learn to detect certain objects, detect certain concepts occurring in raw data, and it leverages certain sensors like vision data, audio data, textual data to perceive this information, and it can make judgments, which is, in the context of detection, it can decide whether, it should be classified into a specific class, whether you should estimate a specific real number. In terms of, an unsupervised learning problem, you try to, it decides, which things have to be grouped together. Um, so that's the, I guess that's the broader, that's the crude type of application. But in a, more metacognitive sense, my belief is artificial intelligence will entail of systems that can demonstrate, more complex behaviors like, Socratic type of instruction, where when someone asks you a question, you might want to ask them a question back. which will help the user to find the solution. And that might differ based on the scenario, and being able to make that decision of whether I should be Socratic or whether I should be enabling this person to unblock their uncertainty and move forward, making that decision, learning to make that decision. So all of that to me is mimicking human like behavior or intelligence.
All right. So
Yeah.
let's stick with that broad definition of AI for
Hmm.
the rest of conversation, but
Hmm.
shelve it for now for a bit.
Hmm.
On another page,
Hmm.
you mentioned you've been working with open educational resources for a while. I'm interested in the broad understanding of open education. What does
Hmm.
open mean to you in that context?
So to me, open education, for simplicity within my taxonomy, internal taxonomy, I try to think of open education similar to open educational resources, where you have different levels of openness that works for different stakeholders. But at the end of the day, again, it would mean to me that, at the most open level, you need, the resource, the technology, the people, and the process. Well, the technology and the processes, at least, being, openly available, which means other people can learn about these artifacts. They can learn the know-how and understand it with the information that is publicized, and they also have capabilities to reuse and adapt them, repurpose them. Uh, but then, based on the priorities of the stakeholders, there may be certain caveats to that, where sometimes you might have the model openly available, but then you would not allow someone to repurpose the model, or there are specific use cases where the creators of the AI technology or the material or the infrastructure intend for others to use that tool set for, and they might be happy to restrict the secondary users to repurpose them in specific ways. So yeah, I mean, to me, open education is again like that, which can have multiple levels, but the essence is, you uncover the internal workings in a way that other people can understand, what they are presented with.
Okay. And when you mention different open levels, do you mean that something is kind of on a spectrum from less open to more open, or are they just qualitatively different kinds of open?
So I think I would say, less open to more open. And but I think when you go to the details of that, it would also entail a bit of like different aspects of, different verticals of information that could be uncovered, that could be closed, which would make the different levels. So I think it would be more like a radar plot rather than a unidimensional, uh, way of looking at it.
Right.
Um,
And then it's a mix of both.
yes.
Hmm. Okay. So I guess taking this definition of open education, where openness is when information is publicly available, people can learn about it, they're able to reuse it, change it up for their own purposes, and also taking the back from the shelf our definition of AI, which
Mhm,
is algorithms that can learn complex patterns from
mhm,
data and exhibit human-like behavior. When we put them together,
mhm.
what do we get? How do you see openness in the context of AI in education?
I see it the same way. So, for example, you could have AI solutions where you can open up everything, where when I mean, the experimental methods or the hypotheses that are used to develop the training mechanisms, the data sets, the architectures of the AI systems, the way it is trained, the results obtained, and the potential use cases, etc. Or you can, have it unrestricted where you can say, okay, you can use this for whatever you want. And and then, you can say you can take this model and retrain it further, etc., etc., which would make them very open, sort of like public domain or, CCBY level of openness. And then you could also have, different degrees of openness where you could say, okay, here is a technology where we restrict you for using this technology for these specific applications. And there's that side of, so I think you can do that and still be open about, what applications this model is suitable for and what applications the model is not suitable for, which may not, perfectly align with what you intend for the end users to use it for versus what it does not. uh, but yeah, so you can have that level of openness as well. And then, you can also get into the model transparency aspects when you're talking about openness. And, sometimes certain solutions that we want to develop, specifically with AI, may not necessarily have to be humanly intuitive in terms of the model representations, for example, for the end goal. So in that sense, implicitly there could be certain restrictions that could be there for these models. And, for me, that would constitute, similarly different levels of openness. And, sometimes you might not want to, expose the data that you have used for certain models that may be for, competitive advantage reasons, which, to me, it still makes sense because, at the end of the day, we all need to be sustainable while we become open. And sometimes part of being sustainable is having these, unique value propositions that you can exploit in order to contribute more towards sustainable outcomes. So for these reasons, one might be motivated not to expose certain data, for example. And there's a lot of investment that would go into, harnessing these type of data, for example. And, I would think, I would argue people also have a right to, have a return on that investment and that risk-taking effort. Yeah, so because of that, AI technologies as well, I would see different levels of openness which are acceptable. But I believe the essence or the, critical factor is that we should work on sort of standardizing and building frameworks that would make healthy decision making, scenarios for, scoping the level of openness.
Hmm. Yeah. And I see how you're saying things could be more or less open in different aspects, and maybe like fully open on all aspects isn't necessarily what we're going for.
Yeah, I mean, it can be bad. I mean, we have currently, scenarios where, for example, this is becoming slightly, I think, not, I would say, not globally representative. I'm just taking anecdotes that, I have, seen in news, for example, where, for example, models like Llama, you would, have certain levels of openness. And then, there could be certain governments who would disregard how the user, how the creators intend for the model to be used and use it, for example, defense or offensive scenarios and try to harness that framework for destructive purposes. And, that itself being completely open might harm the ecosystem. So because of that, I think different levels of openness is necessary. Uh,
Okay, that speaks a little bit about the risks of it as well.
yeah.
And Can you think of any examples of AI technologies that you would call open AI?
Uh, for me, again, for me, open AI models, um, models like T5, for example, Google T5 model, where, the weights are Creative Commons licensed and, they're licensed in a way where there is no specific restriction that is commercially motivated. So for example, for me, I have a bit of a, disagreement with, for example, how the llama models are licensed, where when you pass a specific level of usage, your terms of use changes, for example, and that is mainly motivated around, commercial exploitation. For me, that can become a bit problematic in terms of being, a clear level of openness. But models like T5, where you have a very standard license, where the code is Apache licensed and the weights are Creative Commons license, which means there are very specific directives about how the model could be used in an unrestricted way for specific use cases. I think that for me is a good example.
Right.
That not being conditional in a specific vertical.
Hmm. And so when we're thinking about specific aspects of openness, it sounds like the information being available is one, and then also conditions what you can use it for, how you can use it is another that are really
Yeah,
important to you.
yeah.
Hmm. And moving on a bit, how do you perceive the role of open AI technologies in enhancing education? What can it do for education?
I think open education is a very important, sorry, open AI is a very important part of our next few years of education, how education would and should evolve, because AI has a lot to bring around one thing, understanding the enormous amount of digital knowledge that is available in the world. The other thing about how to streamline the information overload to different users who have different learning needs. Um, and Open artificial intelligence is specifically important for getting equity in terms of how everyone could benefit in the world with these cutting edge technologies. And yeah, that is where you have this being open in unconditionally in specific verticals becomes very important, because that is where for certain, for example, for developing countries, there are a lot of benefits of being able to have models that you can use at their level of expertise that is available in that country, the level of infrastructure that they can support in their countries, for example, for them to take sole ownership. Having the right restrictions matter a lot. Um, all in all, I think it has a huge role to play, because we are also sort of, the definition of formal education is also getting very blurry over time, where the courses that you have in a master's program, for example, can be very flexible in terms of individuals' learning intentions. And with this type of, I would say, destandardization, having tools that can help humans manage structural knowledge acquisition at scale will become more and more important, because the more diverse the learning pathways even within a formal classroom becomes, scaling support for scaffolding that pathway becomes exponentially complex. And as far as we are concerned, AI is one of the key solutions that we can hypothesize that can address this problem right now. So I would think it is very important that these technologies are open so that everyone has access to them, and also everyone can make their own determinations of the suitability of specific technologies that are out there for their own use cases, and have the leg room to make certain adaptations or modifications to that solution to better fit for their own scenarios.
Mhm. I see. And have you seen any examples of where open AI technologies might have already positively impacted education?
Well, I mean, right now, I think, most of the examples are very, I mean, at least my personal exposure is mainly to research based studies where, a specific country would take a model like Llama and build their own, build a platform for their own university in their own language or something like that. I don't have anything, anything doesn't come to my mind as a specific scenario from University X for this use case Z type of thing. But I can recall reading multiple use cases like that, where open models have been used to, adapt. But many use cases that we have right now rely on non-open technologies like ChatGPT, because of the convenience and the ease of, the less steep learning curve of getting into the application and, getting everything up and running. But, in the longer term, when people become more and more fluent and become more and more capable of controlling AI technologies to suit their own scenarios, then this will become a problem. Uh, Things that they rely on not being open. Yeah.
Interesting. So it changes over time. That really feeds into the next question I had for you, which is, do you
Mhm.
see any emerging trends or developments that are going to shape or influence the future of openness in AI?
Yeah. I mean, for me, one thing, I mean, there is a slight bias because I'm also actively researching on certain elements of sustainable education with AI. And I think, my personal opinion is we are kind of passing an era where we've made a lot of breakthroughs at the cost of, unconditional resource investment. So until, probably 2 or 3 years ago, the intention was let's throw as much money as we want. We want to show that we can do better. And I think now we've reached a point where we are, very happy with what we've achieved there. Now we are trying to say, okay, now we have to stop throwing money and make it more efficient, make it more sustainable, make it, more accessible. And that is where I think in the next few years, openness will become a problem or an opportunity, not a problem, an opportunity where we can decentralize that journey to democratizing this know-how into manageable solutions. So, a country can take ownership of building localized solutions for themselves from this breakthrough that we have achieved as a planet, for example. And yeah, and that is a key factor for openness. And also, I mean, it is about utilization, and it is also about how do you harness these technologies to stimulate local economies and make a level playing ground for everyone, so that there's no exacerbation of the gap between the capable and the disadvantaged. uh, So in order to do that, being, having access to these technologies with minimal restrictions is important. And yeah, I mean, in education as well, I mean, some of the things that, some of the research questions that I am facing right now are about, okay, how do we build, models that can provide very, uh, engaging learning experiences like a human tutor without having to rely on a, several billion parameter model. Um, and that is a, big problem because, a lot of, I mean, more than half the world does not have reliable internet connections. And, I come from Sri Lanka, where, when there is a countrywide, power crisis, even the telecom providers have to stop, supporting the signal antennas, and there's no internet. So it's like, when there's a power cut there, you can't call someone from your mobile, and then, you can't rely on these connections to, reach a central server. And even, even with models like Llama, for example, if we try to implement this type of model in Sri Lanka, the first thing is it's very difficult to find people who already have the expertise to maintain infrastructure like this on the long term. I mean, we can stay and engage with them to build up the infrastructure for 3, 6 months, and then we have to move on. UCL, for example. And then someone should be there who's capable of, taking ownership and, continuing to run the solution. You don't have a lot of people who can do that. And if you train people, they migrate because everyone's looking for better opportunities as per individuals. So some, technologies, as good as they are on paper, they are not suitable for the entire world. So I think in the next few years, there'll be a lot of emphasis on trying to downsize. How do we build innovative, sort of decentralized AI systems where you can have much smaller models that can, work in certain contexts, for example. And, so some of the things that I'm working on, for example, is can we build much smaller models that are like 60 million, 70 million parameter models that can just focus on, okay, this model is really good at teaching engineering. This one is really good at teaching biology. This one is really good at teaching business studies, whatever. And then, in countries like Sri Lanka, what you would have is, you might have certain, like, for example, what we do is you have temples because it's a Buddhist country. But a lot of temples also have this community center where you might have computers, and a lot of villagers go there to learn about computers, etc. And even if they had a laptop, if they didn't have internet, what we can do is then, go to this place. For the next 2 weeks, I'm going to learn about these specific topics in engineering, so I can download the models that I want for that, and then the materials that I want for that. I go home and I do my study offline, and then I come back, and then I change the models that I take home with me. So rather than having a big model that does everything, we are focusing on building systems where you have a swarm of small models, and then, relatively complex planning, layer, which could be a reinforcement learning algorithm or another LLM, which is not as big as a massive language model, that can learn to exploit these micro skills and create high quality learning experience in a scoped, condition set. So I think these type of solutions will become more and more emergent and demanded going forward, because I mean, we've been trying to solve the internet problem for decades. We are like, oh, okay, no, internet will come, and internet doesn't go. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And speaking a bit to, I guess, more widespread implementation of AI in education, do you see any challenges that would be specific to OpenAI that maybe regular closed it or not open AI systems wouldn't have?
Uh, I think the main thing would be taking ownership, because you need volunteers who have motivation to take ownership, accountability, and run their own systems in some sense, which is, a hard factor. Everyone wants to delegate the hard part to someone else, which is very well done in closed models because there are commercial entities who profit from it. But if you have these decentralized systems, you would run into a scenario where you might not be able to scale this level of maintenance for individual implementations you want to, spin off. I think that would be the main, that would be one of the main things. And, with that, there's also the fact that, we need to make sure that there is this skill set, yeah, people with the right skill at the right place to take up these challenges, which is also something we need to work on. I mean, we are at the very early stages of AI being prominent at a global scale, so people know very little about AI. I mean, I have co-founders I work with who are like, really clueless, who would go to ChatGPT instead of Google search, and who would, every question where we get stuck in a meeting, they'll ask ChatGPT. So we need to get through this phase and get people more aware of the implications of using AI as a tool. And so that also becomes a challenge, because, different implementations of AI models, while it brings flexibility, it also brings diversity, which means the level of preparation that is needed for different communities who are interacting with these different open systems will need to be different. So that might also become a complex challenge. Yeah, I mean, those are the main things I could see. And the other thing, of course, is, it could go, it's unlikely, but, people, the big organizations who are open sourcing, great solutions right now might stop doing that if open platforms start picking up and, hurting the bottom line. For example, if large corporations see true financial benefits in, running their own systems than relying on these companies for $1 million contracts, then, these guys might end up, I mean, they will definitely end up stopping releasing new things into the open world, which can also become a challenge in the short term at least. But, I mean, open communities are very resilient to that type of challenges. And there are mechanisms in play, that we've learned through open source ecosystems, for example, to address that type of effects. But I would think it's more about the operationalization of decentralized AI that would be a challenge.
Right. So questions of ownership, accountability, stability, and just
And the
increased complexity.
preparedness. Yeah.
Hmm. I see. And we've spoken a little bit about the risks associated with the use of OpenAI. Like you mentioned,
Hmm.
we might not always want full
Yeah.
openness. Um, are there any risks in particular that you reckon are very important in educational contexts?
Yeah. I mean, well, it's again, I think it's more of a philosophical question about what is the right behavior we expect from a, intelligent tutor or an AI-enabled learning environment. Different stakeholders or different demographies might have different, definitions of safe and right use of AI implementations. So, I mean, I think in a personal or a societal view, there might be, there's a risk of people using open technologies to evolve into harmful technologies. that could be used for, I mean, for me, as AI in educational resources, I consider any process where you transfer knowledge from one medium to a human being as a form of learning. So, these technologies might enhance how, terrorist organizations can radicalize people, or how political parties can polarize people behind their own ideas. And it could, help, some motivated people to sort of misrepresent financial gains or economic gains of specific types of agendas. So there are, you can't specifically, you might not specifically be able to call it misinformation per se, but there can be definitely ways of enhancing, ways of deception using these new AI technologies, which can deliver knowledge and information to people at scale. And it can also, significantly increase the rate of exposure and prevalence of these effects. Um, so I think that is a massive risk that we need to anticipate.
Hmm. And speaking to risks like this, and also remembering that all the different benefits that we could harness, what steps do you think we could or should take to move it to, I guess, a better
Mm.
tomorrow, promoting openness in AI in education?
Yeah. I mean, I think, for me, the primary thing is we need to have a lot of discussions to understand what is acceptable definition of good AI, and what are the boundaries we should defend at all costs. The first bit is to establish the parameters, because then we can measure, we can monitor, and we can manage, mitigate, or uh, react. So I think that's the first step, where we have large scale discussions on a global scale among experts and other stakeholders to define what are the priorities and what are the worst case scenarios. And towards that worst case scenario, where should we have the alarm bells ringing? And if we have that established, I believe then people can work towards building tools that can, detect the level of, how close are we to that line? Are we crossing the line? Are we moving towards that line? You can build tests around it. You can build data sets around it. You can build frameworks around evaluating that, monitoring that. And you can also build counter arguments, counter measures against those, prevalences. So I think that would be the, you know, main step that we should be focusing on. It's kind of like, fairness in AI as well, like, biasing, debiasing AI. The first step is to define what is fairness, what is fair, what is biased, and what is counter bias. And then you can, build tools that can measure biasness, and then you can build tools that will move you on the other direction. Um, so yeah, I think defining the scope is the first step.
Hmm. Something that comes to mind is Goodhart's law, saying
Mm.
that once a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good metric. Do you think that will also apply here?
Yes, definitely. I mean, we are a species that are hardwired to take shortcuts. So we tend to think about, not holistically optimizing things, to, focus on very specific things that are easy for our mind to process, and, optimize or game that specific scope. So, I mean, it can definitely become a problem. But for that as well, you could build on, reviewing these frameworks and thinking about increasing the scope of the, different sets of metrics that you need to be concerned about. And I think if we have a various amount of uh, you know, effort put into thinking about it, my expectation is that there's going to be a lot of proposals coming out, which will be decentrally, picked up by different clusters of researchers, stakeholders with their own contextual decision-making capabilities, and, decide to monitor and, keep all of them alive. So I think at least at a holistic level, there's going to be different fronts that are going to be, you know, taking care of different metrics, also thinking about how other solutions are pushing these metrics out while the people who are building those solutions might be focusing on other metrics. So I think there's still, hope in terms of once we have the, alert set up, someone will point it out, and if it is becoming harmful significantly over time, other people will get convinced that okay, this is actually something that we should look at. I mean, that is my expectation. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's also something we should learn. But yeah, I guess the main thing is, while we identify these things, it's harmful to narrow them down in a very extreme sense. Uh, but if we don't have anything to measure, then we don't know where we are. I think that's even more dangerous and harmful. And even if we one day establish we are too far, we don't know where to go from there. Yeah.
Right. So it sounds like next steps will be sort of orienting ourselves as a community, although we'll constantly need to be re-orienting and reevaluating where we
Yeah.
are and where we're
So I
going
think,
next.
yeah, I think it's about building a good loss landscape, establishing the physics of that landscape so that when we are going downhill, we know which way, in which direction that would be meaningful uphill from there. Yeah.
Makes sense. So that really wraps up my questions. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. It's been a very interesting conversation. Now, before we
No
wrap
worries.
up, is there anything else you'd like to add or discuss that we haven't covered?
Not in particular. I mean, I think it's a, yeah, I mean, open AI, open artificial intelligence is a very interesting concept. But yeah, I think it's as many open things, it will need some time and resources to sort of, mature and establish its boundaries. And I mean, someone has to make the first step in, putting it out there and building up the, momentum. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's good to, think about these problems, and, it will become, AI will become as important as, coding solutions or, programming projects going forward. And it's good to have that, standardization, or build the dimension space so you can look at things objectively, and have a similar sort of metric where you can communicate with multiple people and expect everyone to see a similar picture about anything you present. So yeah, I mean, that's very I think that's very useful. And in a time where open educational resources, for example, is I mean, it has its value, but at the same time, I think one of the problems with these type of buzzwords is that they have their lifetime or shelf life. and we need to make sure that we go beyond that and somehow integrate it into a more sustaining, more longer running agenda, so that when the funding starts looking at a new buzzword, this doesn't get left behind. Yeah.
Makes sense. All right. Well, we'll see what happens, but let's keep the
Mhm.
conversations going.
Yes.
In the next couple
Okay.
of weeks, we'll be
Mhm.
wrapping up research findings, and I'll share with you what other participants have said as well.
Cool, cool.
Thanks a
Yes.
lot.
All
I'll
right,
stop the
Vidminas.
recording here.
Yes.
There.